All right. Well, welcome everyone to tonight's webinar. We're going to be talking about bear identification and differentiating between black bears and brown bears, otherwise known as grizzlies. What I want to do to get started here, though, is talk to you about the ground rules. You all know that I'm here for you. This is why we do these webinars, is so you have professional biologists that can answer your questions and provide you with the leading information. And so we want you to ask questions, but when I'm teaching, when I'm going through the slides, if we could keep the chatter in the chat box down, that would be fantastic. The one thing I will tell you is this webinar is being recorded. I can't see you, can't hear you, but we can see everything that you type in the chat box, and that will be recorded. So be mindful of what you type. But here's another thing, is we're going to be talking about black bears and brown bears, otherwise known as grizzlies. A lot of different behavioral differences, how you react sometimes if you ask questions. Just understand that all bears are individual animals, and we can tell you what typically happens, what their behavior is, but there's no guarantee. So this is just telling you that we will teach you, and we'll provide the statistics and things that you ought to do in the wild, but again, understand that bears are individuals and they could react crazily. I've seen it before. So just don't think that what we say is 100% solid proof of what's going to happen. These bears can surprise you at sometimes, so that's your warning. And so bear with it. So I'm going to get started here. And what we're going to do today, we are going to dive into this whole topic of bear identification and whether or not it's a brown bear or whether or not it is a black bear. Sometimes it could be a little bit tricky. It'll keep that image in your mind as far as the current slide, because that's one of the trickier ones. And so hopefully we're going to walk you through the steps to learn how to identify these two different types of bear species, because your reaction to them could be very different. And so the basic understanding is knowing right off the bat what kind of animal you're dealing with. And so I'm going to be the main presenter. My name's Daryl Ratajek, wildlife biologist, and y'all know my background. I don't believe we have any new students on tonight's class, but I did get my degree in wildlife management way back early 90s. Tells you how old I am. I worked a lot with bears at the Appalachian Bear Center, and then as the deer, bear, elk coordinator for the state of Tennessee. So not only did I work with individual bears, I managed bear populations. Served a stint as chief of wildlife, but y'all know that I am an educator at heart. There's some biologists that are, in fact, most biologists are much more brilliant than I am, but they have a difficult time talking to people. And so that's my specialty. I like educating folks on wildlife and putting it in terms that they can understand. I will tell you that I am happy to have Stephanie Payne joining us today. She is going to be monitoring the chat room. I've known Stephanie for a long, well, not super long, but probably about 7 or 8 years now. She too has her degree, and if you don't mind, Steph, I'm going to talk for you since your internet connection is a little wonky. Stephanie received her degree from Oregon State University. She specialized in human-wildlife dynamics, which is really cool. It's where we have these conflict. When humans and wildlife get together, it doesn't always turn out as a good thing. And so she specializes in that. But her claim to fame is really cool. I kind of am really jealous of her because she coordinates an amazing program, this wildlife human incident training. And what she does is she teaches state, federal, and provincial agencies about bear attacks, cougar attacks. It's mainly for law enforcement and folks that work for the government agencies, but that's what she does. So she's a whiz when it comes to bears. She loves cougars as well, and she's going to be joining me, and she's going to be moderating the chat room. So thank you, Stephanie, for joining in. I also have Trish on board. Trish is a longtime volunteer for us. Trish usually handles some of the technical questions if people are having difficulty. So if Stephanie or Trish answer a question, they're there for you as well. So with that, I'm going to jump into tonight's presentation. And we're going to talk about the two different species for today. The first one, obviously, is black bears. Most of you are very, very familiar with black bears. They're my bear of specialty. And in case you don't know, their Latin name is Ursus americanus. I'm not going to go into too much detail about biology and behavior of black bears because I've taught so many classes about it, but I'm happy to answer questions. But the other species that we're going to be talking about tonight are brown bears. And if you look at their Latin name, they are Ursus arctos. And so the brown bear is this other bear that you may get a chance to encounter if you go out and visit Yellowstone. And so someone out there might be thinking, wait, time out. What's going on? How come we're not talking about grizzlies? Well, I need to explain something when it comes to brown bears and grizzlies. And some of you may have seen this slide before, and I'm showing it to you again. Because there's sometimes confusion as to what is classified as a grizzly or what is a brown bear. And so here is a photo of what many people consider a grizzly. And if you look at their Latin name, it's Ursus arctos. A brown bear, sometimes they're called Alaskan brown bears, but brown bears in general look a little bit different. They're much, much larger and kind of blockier looking. And if you look at their scientific name, guess what? It's Ursus arctos. And so what that means is these two animals are identical. They're the exact same species. They're identical in the species standpoint, but not in looks. Because what happens here is animals of the same species can sometimes appear very different. Just think of the human species, Homo sapiens. Someone who is maybe a native Alaskan looks different than someone that is from China or from Africa. Lots of variations. And so that's what we're seeing here with these grizzlies and brown bears. They're all brown bears. But if you look at the grizzly, the variety is the greatest name of a variety ever. It's Ursus arctos horribilis. And those brown bears along the Alaska coast, especially if you're on Kodiak Island, is Ursus arctos middendorfi. And so, again, same species, just different variety or subspecies. You know how much I hate the whole subspecies argument, so I won't go into that. Main reason why they look so different is pretty much geographic difference. And it's not so much the climate, but what it boils down to is what they're eating. So one of the things that really classifies a brown bear as a grizzly is they're found along the interior part of the continent. So they're in the southern Rocky Mountains. They're not the southern Rocky Mountains, but they're in the American Rocky Mountains as well as the Canadian Rockies. And so they're not found so much along the coast. The brown bears that are found along the coast are what we call those Alaskan brown bears. And so if you look at the big difference, those interior bears, those grizzlies are mostly eating vegetation. They are eating some meat. They're eating carrion. They may take down an elk here or there if they stumble upon it. But for the most part, those brown bears along the coast are feeding on that rich, rich salmon run. And so their diet is vastly different because those Alaskan bears tend to get a much richer, healthier diet. They grow much larger than a typical inland grizzly. So grizzly or brown bear, I might use it interchangeably today, but now you know the difference. They're pretty much the exact same species, but it all depends on where you're encountering this brown bear. If it's interior, you call it a grizzly. If it's along the coast, it's usually a brown bear. All right. I should have clicked to this. Easy way to remember, every grizzly is a brown bear, but not every brown bear is a grizzly. So that's one thing that helps keep it straight for a lot of people. So what I want to do is I want to jump in and do a little bit different flair because I give so many bear presentations and it talks about how wonderful these animals are and it's great. It's a wonderful experience, and they are. They're absolutely fantastic. But then there's this small part of it that, hey, we're talking about bears here. Like a bear. Is a bear really dangerous? And so the good thing is we do have information on bear attacks or these not so good bear encounters, and anyone has access to it. You could look it up. I will tell you, if you flat out Google it, a lot of times they refer you to Wikipedia, which isn't too bad. But if you're really interested on bear information, there's some great books. Stephen Herrero is the expert on bear attacks in North America. But if you just Google information, just remember, you always have to be mindful of your source, so make sure it's a credible source. But one thing that's really interesting when you look at some of these bear encounters and these not so good encounters where there's sometimes a fatality, if you look to see where they occur, things start jumping out at you. And so what's interesting is, for the most part, they occur in national parks and national forests. And where do you think most people go to vacation or to recreate? They're oftentimes going to a national park or a national forest. And so you have tremendous opportunity if you go to visit one of these places that you may encounter a bear, especially if you're going up in the Yellowstone Glacier area where we're going to have grizzlies, or obviously all the way up into Alaska. And so I will tell you, if you recreate and you climb mountains like that, bears are the least of your worries, because that is a lot crazier than walking in bear country. So another question you might have is, why are we talking about this? Attacks are so rare. I agree 100%. They don't occur that often. But I want you to think about something. If y'all know what that is, y'all know that's a big old lightning storm that you don't want to get caught in. And the funny thing is, getting struck by lightning is extremely, extremely rare. But how many folks know what to do when a lightning storm comes in? I bet you everyone out there. You know that you got to get to shelter. You don't want to hunker down under a large tree. You don't want to make yourself look. It's second nature. But the thing is, getting struck by lightning is like a 1 in a million type of chance there. And so if we know what to do in a lightning storm, why doesn't everyone know about bears or what to do with a bear encounter? And so obviously, if you're recreating somewhere that has black bears and grizzlies, you don't want this. I swear, I put this up because this is like the nastiest, meanest looking bear out there. Typically, this is not the type of encounter you're going to have. But I will tell you, this is what the vast majority of people may encounter. They're going to see an animal. They're going to pull over. Y'all know what the Smokies is like. People jump out of their cars and start chasing bears. Good thing in the Smokies, you only have to worry about black bears. But if you're anywhere out west, you better know what bear you're jumping out and chasing. Obviously, we don't want you chasing any of them. And so this is something that thousands upon thousands of people encounter every year, is they're engaging with these bears and they're having these somewhat close encounters, and you better know what bear you're looking at. So anyway, the bottom line, when it comes down to your behavior around bears, the very basic thing you ought to know right off the bat is, what kind of bear are you dealing with? Are you dealing with a black bear, or are you dealing with a grizzly? And so that's what this class is going to be all about. I see there's a lot of chatter. Just let me make sure. Okay. Thanks, Steph, for keeping up on that. I so very much appreciate you doing that. Okay, so what I want to do is just talk a little bit about the difference between that black bear and the grizzly. And so a bear is a bear is a bear, right? You react the same way. It's a bear. It doesn't matter what it is. Well, let's put on the science thinking cap type of thing. And again, I hate going to these bear attack statistics, but they're really going to start painting a picture for you. First and foremost, what I have here is I created this graph to show you what these encounters, or these fatal attacks, what they've done over the last century. And I broke it out decade by decade, starting 1910 all the way up to 2010. So we're just starting 2020, so I wish we could erase 2020, but here's the data for everything. And so you can see early on, there was not much happening, but then it took off. 1960s, we're seeing exponential growth in these very severe encounters. So does anyone know why that happened? And there's two things I'm looking for. So why do we see this sudden crazy growth in these severe bear encounters? Anyone know? More bears and more humans. Yes, you guys nailed it. Obviously, if you attend my classes, you've seen this graph that I put up. Human populations are increasing, but what many people don't understand is bear populations are also increasing. And so you have these two populations, more and more, and we're not getting any more land, and so we're definitely going to be having more and more of these encounters. But here is another thing that I'm really going to attribute to it, and it's a wonderful thing. If you look back in the 50 years ago, you did not have a lot of women recreating in the outdoors. I know growing up, my mom would have none of it. That was a guy thing. And fortunately, those things are changing. So we're having a huge demographic of women that are now recreating in the outdoors. So besides that human population going, the way we recreate is also changing. And so we're having more and more encounters. I don't want to get into it, but you're seeing a shift where some of these bad encounters used to mostly all be men, but now it's more and more women. So I'm so glad you're here because you have to know the information just like anyone else. All right. Now we're going to start talking about the individual bear species. So keeping on with this graph about what has been going on over the last 100 years, if we look at these severe encounters over the last century, you'll see what has happened with black bears. And so you see it's this steady growth over time. And then if we lay brown bears on it, guess what? The graph is almost identical. And so these two lines almost lay on top of each other. There's some subtle differences if you start picking it apart. But right off the bat, as soon as I plotted that, it's like, oh my gosh. It doesn't matter if you encounter a black bear or a brown bear or a grizzly. They're just as equally likely to have a negative interaction with you. And so that would be true unless you know more about these individual species. And so if you look at where these bears are found, let's go over that bear range. So talking about black bears first, obviously we know when before the Europeans came to North America, black bears were found all over the continent. Almost every single place had black bears. Unfortunately, we don't live well with wildlife, and their range has been beaten back. They've been wiped out in a lot of parts, but they're still found in almost every state in the United States, as well as every province in Canada. So they're still very populous animal. So much so that their population is estimated anywhere between 500,000 and 800,000 black bears. That's a lot of black bears living in North America. So what's it look like for the brown bear? Well, it's a little bit different story because right off the bat, they were not found all over North America. They're primarily a Western type of species on this continent. But once again, we didn't live well with them, unfortunately, and we reduced their range tremendously. And so this is where brown bears are found. And so obviously all of Alaska, far north, western Canada, but it comes down the Canadian Rockies and dips all the way into some of those northwestern states. Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, even parts of Washington have brown bears in it. But if you look at their population is much different than black bears. Much smaller, only 50,000 to about 80,000 brown bears. And just so you know, don't worry about brown bears from a species standpoint. They are one of the most widespread animals in the world. They go all over the northern hemisphere, so Asia, Europe, they're found everywhere. They're found in Italy, just crazy places that these brown bears are found. But their population is definitely much smaller than black bears in North America. So if you look at the two, we have about 10 times more black bears than we do brown bears. Yet you saw those two graphs, they're almost identical. So which bear do you think you better know what you're dealing with, because they have a little, or well, I shouldn't say little, they have a much different temperament than black bear. That's right. Brown bears, you really need to know how to behave around these animals, because they typically have a much shorter fuse when it comes to humans. Don't get me wrong, they're not something you need to run in terror from, but you just better know what you're doing. All right, so let's start looking at some of the differences between black bears and brown bears. And so first and foremost, right away, some people will say, oh, size. Brown bear is so much bigger than a black bear. And so if you look at the average human, there's male and female silhouette there of a human. You look at an adult black bear, and it's roughly about the same size. It's a little bit bigger, a little bit bulkier than a human. And so that's how big they typically are. The brown bear, on the other hand, can get much, much larger. And so right away you're like, oh, there's the difference. But here's the thing. You could have a fairly large black bear, and you could have a fairly small-ish brown bear. And when you compare those two, they're almost identical in size. And so size might not be the best indicator. Obviously, if you see a 1,400-pound brown bear, you know black bears never get that big. But for the most part, it can be confusing at times because their size could be very, very similar. And so you can't go on size. So what's the next best thing? Well, let's go with color. And in this, it's easy. Black bears are blue and brown bears are orangish. Unfortunately, it's not that simple. They come in lots of different colors. So let's break it down. What are some basic colors that these bears come in? And so let's start looking at the color black. Let's deal with black bears. And so there are a lot of black bears out there. This is actually like one of the blackest bears I've ever seen, because even its muzzle is dark. Typically, they have a lighter muzzle. But you know, lots of black bears come in this color black. This was the only instance where I actually found a photo of a black-ish brown bear or grizzly. It does have a head that's still brown, but you can see how dark that fur is. And so if you see something right off the bat and you see a large body that's black, remember, it's most likely a black bear, but there are instances of some really, really dark or even black looking grizzlies. All right, so if we're not talking about black, let's move over to dark brown. Obviously that should be easy. Well, here you go, folks. This is a dark brown black bear. Beautiful. Here's another dark brown brown bear. And so the coat is almost identical in color. So you can see where there's a lot of overlap here. Well, what about light brown? Obviously, black bears don't get light brown. Well, here's a light brown black bear. And here's a light brown grizzly. And so you can see the coloration is very, very similar. So it could cause confusion. All right, let's get crazy here. What about blonde? For sure, there's no blonde. Well, there's a blonde black bear right there. And then obviously we have lots of blonde grizzlies out there. So again, just because you see a blonde animal, you can't differentiate between a black or a brown bear. All right, now let's get really crazy. We all know that there's those silverish, those glacial bears. Nobody can ever confuse that, because that is one of the coolest looking black bears there is. Well, believe it or not, grizzlies can have a silverish looking color too. And so from a distance, it might not be real easy to differentiate these two. And last but not least, all right, let's get crazy. Let's have a mixed. Here's a black bear that doesn't know what it wants to be, because it's got blonde, it's got brown, it's got black. And so that's, you know, that's a black bear. Well, grizzlies could have that mixed color too. And so you can start to see, especially when you have a bear of average size, it might be really difficult to differentiate between the two. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on what you need to look for in order to differentiate between the two. But before we do that, let's talk a little bit. So size and color can be misleading. So just don't leave your final determination just being based on the size or the color of the bear. But before we do that, okay, we're going to look at 4 distinguishing characteristics that you need to look for that will help you make the determination whether or not you're looking at a black bear or you're looking at a grizzly. So first and foremost, claws, and we'll go over the different thing. But there's only 4 things that you need to look for. If you can see the claws are a distinguishing characteristic. You can also look for that hump, that shoulder hump. Another thing you can look for is a difference in the ears. I don't like this one. This one's not very easy to tell. And then the last is the kind of face it has. And so I tried everything. The only good acronym I could come up with is chef. But I promise you look at this and you see the chef. This is the only time I'm going to use this voice. But if you remember that chef, and now you'll never forget it because I just made a fool of myself. But if you remember that, those are the 4 characteristics: the claws, the hump, the ears, and the face. And if you can get a look at those 4 things, hopefully from a binocular or telescope or a spotting scope, you'll be able to tell the difference. So what are those differences between the black bear and the grizzly bear? So starting with the claws, and I've got a bunch of these different graphics here. When it comes to the claws, they're vastly different. Black bears tend to have short, dark claws, whereas grizzlies or brown bears tend to have these long, light-colored claws. And the reason for that is they are serving different functions. Bears being much smaller, or black bears being much smaller, use their claws primarily for climbing. They're very, very good at climbing trees. If you've seen any of my webinars, you know how much black bears love climbing trees. And so their claws are developed for that. I've got a couple that will show the claw up close. The grizzly or the brown bear, on the other hand, their claws are primarily designed for digging. They're oftentimes flipping over rocks, turning over logs, digging in the dirt, looking for food. And so the function of the claws, they're serving 2 different functions, so they're designed differently. And so the black bear, again, short, dark claws. The grizzly has these light-colored, longer claws. The next one, the hump. Remember, we're talking about the chef here. So the hump, obviously, grizzlies are well known for having a very distinct shoulder hump. Black bears, not so much. But look at that picture right there. It almost kind of looks like a shoulder hump. It says no shoulder hump, but it can be misleading at times. But the grizzly definitely has a much more prominent shoulder hump. The next one is the ears, and of all these characteristics, I like this one the least because it's so hard to describe the difference. They'll say prominent ears on a black bear, small round ears on a grizzly. I think the way that I can describe to you is if you were to grab the bear's ear, and I don't recommend doing that, the black bear is going to have a really thin ear, and that's why on profile oftentimes they're kind of narrow and pointed. The grizzly, on the other hand, is a much more poofier ear, oftentimes smaller, rounded. It's like there's more meat to it if you grab it. That's the best way. Again, ears are not a really good defining characteristics, but they can help you. And last but not least is the face. And so on a black bear, you see this fairly straight profile from the forehead all the way to the tip of the nose, usually pretty straight. The grizzly or the brown bear, they say it's a dished profile, and I'm going to show you a slide that talks more about the dished profile. Some people think a dished face is a round face like that. It has more to do with the curvature from the forehead all the way to the nose. Before I click off this slide, you're going to see a couple of things. This won't help you for identifying a bear that's standing in front of you, but if you look at the tracks, difference between a black bear track and a grizzly track is on that grizzly, you can typically draw a straight line between all of its toes and its pad, the main pad. On a black bear, there's some curvature there, and you can't really draw that straight line. And you'll see that in a couple other graphics, but that's one of the main ways to differentiate. And that's really important, because if you're hiking in Yellowstone, Alaska, wherever you're at, and you don't see a bear anywhere, but there's very, very fresh tracks around, by looking at that track, you'll be able to differentiate between a black bear and a grizzly. And so remember, look for that front paw, not the rear paw, but the front paw. And if all those toes, you can draw a straight line between the toes and that main pad, typically you're dealing with a grizzly or a brown bear in that situation. All right, so here's another graphic. Exact same thing. They talk about the claws, the hump, the ears, and the face. And again, they even have the track differentiation here. But again, I won't go through it all. They say the exact same thing. Black bear has short claws, grizzly has long claws, straight profile of the face on the black bear, dished face on the grizzly. The one I like about this one is you can see the difference in their claws. And so if you look at that graphic, that bear claw, the black bear claw, very short, very curved, only about an inch and a half long typically. The grizzly, on the other hand, is a much longer claw. Here's the crazy thing. What color is that? That's pretty dark brown. Whereas other graphics said they're light, very light colored. Typically they're light colored, but they're not always light colored. And so the main thing here is the length. Anywhere from 2 inches to 4 inches. They're designed for digging. It's kind of like you have one of those hoes or those rakes that you can really dig up the ground with those claws. All right, another excellent graphic. I like that they use actual bear pictures instead of cartoon drawings. But they all say the exact same thing. And so remember, look for the claws, look for the hump, presence or absence of the hump, then the ears, which I don't really like, but the dish profile is more prominent on the grizzly. So those are the 4 things. I'm going to take a break real quick, just make sure Stephanie's caught up. Awesome. Thank you, Steph. But if you look at the warning here right at the very bottom middle, it says don't rely on size and color. And that's what I wanted to stress at the very beginning, because if you look at that and you see something black moving and assume it's a black bear, you could be gravely mistaken. Same thing, if you see something blonde coming at you, you could automatically assume it's a grizzly. It could be a black bear. So size and color can be very, very misleading. And so that's why you've got to look at these other characteristics. All right, don't like the cartoon drawings, but the reason I put this one up here is oftentimes someone will talk about the dished face, and what exactly does that mean? So the dished face, well, let's look at the black bear first. And I mentioned a straight profile from the forehead all the way to the tip of the nose. And so there can absolutely be some variation there, but for the most part, most black bears have a fairly straight profile. The grizzly, on the other hand, kind of has this indentation, kind of like a mongoloid type of forehead with a heavy brow. And so it forms this dished face. And the reason we say it's a dished face is, well, at least this is what I assume it to be, it has that dip, that contour of some type of fancy dish. And so, again, you might see a grizzly that has a really straight face. That's why you gotta use the culmination of all 4 of these characteristics and not just one of them. All right. Before we get into quizzing people and show you different things, here's what's really important. Because of the biology of these bears, they're going to behave much differently. And this is why it's so critically important to know what kind of bear you are looking at or dealing with. And so physical characteristics, some of you have seen this already. I had these in the Grizzly webinar not long ago. But a black bear and a brown bear, let's look at some of these physical characteristics really quickly. And so when we're talking about the weight between males and females, you're going to see between the black bear and the brown bear, there can be overlap. You could have a really large black bear. You could have a really somewhat small brown bear. And so there could be overlap. That's why the size of the bear is not a good thing to look at. Height-wise, well, brown bear is so much bigger. Well, typically a black bear 5 to 7 feet tall when it stands on its hind legs. That brown bear is 6 to 9 feet. So once again, there's a lot of overlap in there. This is, again, why size is not a good characteristic. Well, what about their diet? All right, well, good thing here is these two bears are identical when it comes to diet. They're both omnivores. Now, understand, remember, in those brown bears that live along the coast, they're eating a lot more meat, and they grow much larger than those interior grizzlies. But for the most part, these bears are omnivores. They'll eat anything they encounter. And so they're always looking for food. And so they're behaviorally, that's what they're doing. They're just constantly in search of food. Well, what about their temperament? And this is where you start getting the differences between these two bears. Black bears, generally being much smaller, usually about the size of a large human being, tend to be much more docile and more wary. Now, brown bears, because they can grow much larger, they're not always large and not born large, but they can grow to be larger. They've got a different temperament for the most part. They seem to be, and when I say aloof, I mean it not in the stupid way, but in the way that, oh, I just don't care. And part of that is because these brown bears can grow to be much bigger. They're not as threatened by humans anymore. So they don't pay attention. Sometimes they can get aggravated. That's why I say they're standoffish. Instead of running away from a human, they get mad. And unfortunately, it's when they get mad that bad things can happen. And this is why you see some of those statistics start weighing more on the brown bears as being a little bit more aggressive and one that you really, really have to pay more attention to. And so just understand from a temperament standpoint, both these bears, doesn't matter if it's a brown bear or a black bear, they're both very wary of humans. They don't want to associate with us. They don't like us being around. Again, black bears are more inclined to run from us, whereas a brown bear is more inclined to disregard. They will run from us, but if they're really focused on something else, they're just not going to pay attention to us because they're not as threatened by us. And so this, again, because of how big they can grow, these brown bears tend to be a little bit more standoffish. So if you're vacationing, if you're in Alaska, you're in Yellowstone, and you're hiking on a trail, and you encounter a bear on a trail, the best thing to do is give that brown bear, if it is a brown bear, you determine it right away, give that brown bear a wide berth because he's more or less in charge of that situation. Obviously, if he starts coming at you, and this is where I'm going to bring up that video. I'm going to repeat myself, so I'm on the recording now, but there is a video recently that came out of Montana, and it was filmed from a distance from another group of hikers that were higher up on the hill, and they show this grizzly, this brown bear, coming down the trail, and is coming down the trail at a high rate of speed, and there were 3 hikers on the far end of that trail, and the bear started running towards them. And unfortunately, the hikers did what you're not supposed to do. All 3 of them just immediately started running, and they ran in different directions. If you watch that video, you will see exactly what the bear sees, and it's easy to see how that bear can perceive prey scattering. What bears typically, especially brown bears, will typically encounter a small herd of elk, and they'll take off in all different directions. And typically a bear will try to focus, if they're close enough that the bear can run it down, the bear will focus on that smallest elk and try to catch up, and there's his meal for the day. And so as a group of hikers, the last thing you want to do is run in different directions. because you're triggering that bear's predatory instinct. And if you watch that clip, the moment the bear sees those hikers and when they scatter, that bear, for an instant, it wasn't very long, but that bear was interested. He was kind of looking for the one he was going to go after. Fortunately, I think he stopped because of all the screaming. He finally realized they were humans. But the best thing that they could have done in that situation, the hikers, is just all grouped up together, yelled at the bear, got off the trail, but stayed together because you look at statistics, bears will not engage, especially with groups of 3 or more. Typically, any of those bad encounters is when the hiker's by themselves. Occasionally, it's with 2 hikers. But when there's 3 or more people, there's almost no instances of really negative encounters with these bears, regardless if it's a black bear or grizzly. So, does anyone have any questions about that particular encounter or the temperament between black bears and brown bears? I'm going to pause to take a break and check the questions. Man, Steph, you're killing me because you're answering everything. Let's see, which question? Okay, hopefully from Angie. Does a small brown bear have the temperament of a brown grizzly bear, even though small for their type? They start getting, I guess the best way, and I hate I can never say the word, anthropomorphizing, but I think it's good to develop analogies because a young brown bear, especially if it's still with the mom, when it encounters a human, really gets aggravated and upset. And she might huff, she might blow, she might demonstrate. And she is teaching her cubs, hey, here's this human, I could push this thing around. And so I think brown bears at a very young age, they kind of know that they're the big man on the block. And so, yes, if it's a single brown bear, they might not be as bold when push comes to shove, but they're still going to have that attitude like they're the dominant bear. That is why it's so important for you to react properly, because if you understand the situation you're in and a bear is kind of like playing you, trying to figure you out, you can actually show that bear who's in charge, especially if it's a younger bear. But they might be tempted to kind of push you around. And so it's really great if you've watched the bear behavior webinars that I do, either black bears or grizzlies. You got to know the situation. You got to know why that encounter happened, whether or not there's food source, you surprise the bear, or if that bear is acting offensively. That's where you can push back on that bear. So I won't go into all that because that's a whole different webinar. But awesome question. But yeah, brown bears typically have a bolder attitude than black bears from the beginning. Thank you, Steph. I did the cardinal sin of using a word that I use a lot that others might not know as easily. Trish says, will brown bears huff, snap their jaw, and bluff charge as black bears might? Yes, very similar behaviors in that regard. And Trish, the best way that I can describe the difference between black bear and grizzly behavior, they will do similar reactions, but I always describe the brown bear or the grizzly as having a much shorter fuse than a black bear. And so they might pop their jaw and huff, but then they're a lot quicker to do some of the more aggressive behaviors, whether or not it's a bluff charge or the ground swatting. And so they just don't tolerate humans as much as black bears, and they're not as afraid of humans as black bears are. And so black bears tend to have a more drawn out process where they're really not wanting to engage the human. But the brown bears or the grizzlies, they have a shorter fuse. And so this is why oftentimes we have some of those negative encounters, because when that fuse gets tripped and the person is not doing what they're supposed to be doing, unfortunately that can lead to a negative encounter with one of these larger bears. Good question, Trish. Grizzlies are not tree climbers. Remember, their claws are designed for digging, and so they can't dig. They're not as pointy as a black bear's. Now, young grizzlies can climb trees. They're not going to climb as quickly or as efficiently, but once that grizzly starts getting some size on it, they don't climb trees anymore, and that's why some people have suggested about climbing a tree with a grizzly. If you have a tree that you can climb safely, that could be a good thing if you know it's a large grizzly that can't follow you. I will tell you, if you try climbing a tree because you're afraid of a black bear, that black bear can climb that tree faster than you can fall out of it. But for the most part, those bigger brown bears are not going to be climbing trees. Some people say they'll just push them over, but they're not likely to do that if it's a stout tree. Yeah, I wouldn't climb a tree if you only plan on getting about 6 feet, 10 feet off the ground because they will grab you and pull you out. But if it's a tree that you can definitely get well above it, 20 feet or more, then that would be a possibility. But the thing is, when you are hiking, if you hike in the forest a lot, there are lots and lots of trees out there that don't have branches coming all the way down to the bottom, unless you have some pine trees. But then there's so many branches, they're difficult to climb. So it's if you have a good, easy tree to climb, consider yourself blessed and someone looking out for you from above. Okay, so I'm going to let you know that both bears, just so you know, temperament wise, these bears can get very defensive when they have offspring. Doesn't matter if it is a grizzly or a black bear. When they have young about, uh, uh, they can definitely have a mean streak to them. Now, understand that when it comes to those statistics I showed you with the fatalities, unfortunately, the vast majority of those, and when I say vast majority, does not involve a defensive black bear. Black bears don't really cause much damage to humans when they're in this defensive mode. So a mother with cubs might bite you, might swat you, it's just trying to eliminate the threat. They don't prolong that attack. They just want to get their cubs to safety. Unfortunately, not so with the brown bears, because when cubs are threatened, the brown bears want to do the same thing. The grizzlies want to do the same thing. They want to eliminate the threat, but they're such bigger animals, so if they bite you, swat you, sometimes that alone could be the fatal swat. We've had a couple instances in Yellowstone where you surprise a mother with cubs. She doesn't prolong the attack, but it's enough that it does enough damage because they're such a much larger animal. So the bottom line is just be very, very wary of both black bears and grizzlies because they're very protective of their offspring. I'm getting dinged here. Let me turn off my volume so you don't see me getting dinged or hear me getting dinged. Anyway, again, temperament-wise, black bear, grizzly, just be very, very careful if they do have offspring. That picture there, just so you know, those are not two adults. That's a mama with her yearling. And it doesn't matter if it's black bear or grizzly, they typically stay with the mom for about a year and a half. Grizzlies occasionally will keep the offspring around longer if she does not cycle. Occasionally they'll keep their offspring around for 2, possibly 2.5 years. But if she cycles again, they're gone after a year and a half. All right, are you guys ready? This is where it gets fun. And some of these will be repeats. If you saw the Grizzly Country webinar, you're going to see some repeats, but I made sure I put some more pictures. So this is where I need you to get your typing fingers in gear. Oh. Can grizzlies fit 4 large cubs into one den? Yeah, obviously they're going to pick a bigger den, but when mom is going back into the den with her offspring from that year, keep in mind they typically do not go back to the same den. Some dens are used over and over because they're great dens, but they're used by different bears from year to year. typically a bear does not go back to the exact same den. So it doesn't matter if it's a black bear or a brown bear or grizzly. When they have offspring that are going to den with them, they're obviously going to look for that roomier, the bigger house or the bigger den. And so they're going to make sure they're well accommodated for them and all of their offspring. Do bears and do black bears and grizzlies typically choose the same kind of den? They're interested in the same thing, but and primarily, and again, if you've seen some of my past webinars, when it comes to den selection, they're interested in two primary factors. They want it tight to conserve heat, and they want it dry because if they get wet or flooded, they're going to lose heat. So tight and dry. So black bears and grizzlies, depending on the size of the animal, obviously it's going to vary in size of that den site. But what we find oftentimes, and it's fairly the same with black bears, when it comes to denning, they go high up on the mountain. I don't know the exact reason for it, but when winter starts rolling in, it's that photo period, the amount of daylight that is hitting the bear's eyes, it will trigger that bear to say, hey, I better start looking for a den. And so they tend to go higher up in elevation. A lot of that probably has to do with the fact that the higher you go, the less likely you are to get flooded out. Obviously, a bear is not going to be searching for a den site in a floodplain. So they try to get higher up on the hill. And these grizzlies tend to go much higher than the black bears typically. But very similar type of den situation, whether or not it's a blown down tree, a cave or crevice, something that's they can tuck themselves into, stay warm because it's nice and tight, but also stay dry. And so very similar, but it could be different based on the size of the bear. Steph, am I good to go on, or is there a question you want me to go to? Because all I have now is, okay, good. Thanks, Steph. All right, get your typing fingers on because we're gonna go through this quiz. Now remember, size and color are not good, so look for some other distinguishing characteristics. But I'm gonna go picture by picture. You tell me if it's black or brown. This one's easy. Actually, Angie, this is a black bear. I can absolutely see why you'd say it's a grizzly because it's got that big, stocky looking head. But for the most part, black grizzlies are extremely, extremely rare. But you don't see a hump on this bear, so this is definitely a black bear. How about this one? And just so you know, folks, if you guess wrong, don't worry about it. There's some really, like I said, there's some confusing bears out there. This is actually another black bear. This is a cinnamon color. Does not have a very pronounced hump. You can see a somewhat of a hump. But believe it or not, this is just a cinnamon phase black bear taken at a distance. This one should be relatively easy. Yes, I'm not gonna sugarcoat everything. I don't want to build you up and get everything all easy on you, and then you run into a difficult one. We're gonna dive into the difficult ones. This obviously is a grizzly. The hump on there, you start seeing the hump. I don't know how to explain it, and Steph, if you could help me here, there is just a look to their face that I don't know if it's a wider nose or what, but there's a look between grizzly face and a black bear face. If you do this more and more and more and more, which we've done it quite a bit, myself and Stephanie, you can begin to tell the difference in the face. Oh, fantastic. Awesome. Evelyn just said claws. You can see down at the bottom, long, light colored claws. Right away, big cue, hey, this is probably a grizzly. All right, what about this one? Very good. Again, you can start to, after so many, you start seeing a black bear face versus a grizzly face. This is definitely a black bear, brown colored black bear. Yeah, this is pretty easy. This is kind of a typical looking grizzly. Now, you don't see a huge dish to the face. It does have a little dip in there, but you can see it's kind of a longer snout. That nose is a little bit turned upward. One of the key factors here is that prominent shoulder hump. Can't see the claws, but right away you just start learning to differentiate between the grizzly and a black bear. This one is, I don't know if it's the same bear. It very well could be the same bear. But again, you can see that hump, the longer nose. It does have a little dip between the brow and its nose. So this too is a grizzly. All right, what about this one? You should know this because I just realized I used this on one of my slides early on. See, this bear is interesting because it has kind of a, like, I don't want to say cuter face, but it's a softer looking face. A lot of grizzlies have that blocky looking face. It does have a softer face, but guess what, guys? This is still a grizzly. This is still a brown bear. What about this one? Very good. This is a black bear. Now, it does look like this bear has a hump, but understand when a bear has its head down in that position, it's going to over exaggerate its shoulder. And oftentimes that's what you see, especially if you get pictures of black bears. Some black bears look like they got a big hump on them. The one thing that I don't know if I could do a good job explaining, but they're almost, I don't want to say they're
I'm not sure if you guys can hear me. I didn't test my volume, so if I just blared your ears out, I apologize. I think that this is one of those cases where Daryl's going to be the one who's having some technical difficulties. So, he didn't hand over the control for me to be able to actually go through the slides. Trying to see if, yeah, he will return ASAP. So one of the things, though, that he was trying to make sure that we differentiate between is oftentimes you have to look at the bear holistically. It's not something where you can always rely on, the with the sole exception probably of claws. But as you can see in a lot of these pictures, claws aren't something that we can readily always get a view of. And when you're out in the wild, if you come across a bear and it's not from such a distance where you're using binoculars or a spotting scope or something, you're probably not going to immediately say, I need to look at this bear's claws. And if you're that close, it can also be already a scary moment. So, again, holistically, kind of just keep your eye on all of the different features of the. Excuse me. I haven't been talking for a while, so now oh, it looks like Daryl actually crashed on that one. So I think he's probably logging back in right now.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. You're back. I had you covered while you were gone. I just pretty much mentioned that what you were probably talking about is that when you look for any of these characteristics, with the exception of the claws, you really want to look holistically because a lot of images that we've seen and whatnot, you can't necessarily see the claws. If you're in the wild, you might not see claws. So make sure you look holistically at that picture, and then I prayed you'd come back soon.
I actually had a power bump. The whole electricity went down and it kind of reset my internet there. So sorry it took me a little while. But thank you so much for covering. All right, Let's go on to another photo here. I love this photo. This is one of my favorites. What do you think this is? Man, you guys are getting good. This is actually a black bear. No shoulder hump whatsoever. But this is one of those beautiful, beautiful blonde black bears. But look at the face. The face has kind of like it's kind of like a softer, narrower face, as opposed to a grizzly tends to be a wider snout, more stocky or blockier. But this is a beautiful blonde colored black bear. I'm really confusing all of you, so you guys are going to be afraid to visit Yellowstone. But I am definitely showing you the harder to guess ones. For the most part, it's going to be really simple. You know why? Because there's going to be 30 other people standing next to you with cameras telling you what you're looking at. But if you are on the trail and you do encounter a bear, it definitely does help to be able to identify it. All right, what about this one? Yeah, good point, Steph. Understand that myself and Stephanie, we probably looked at thousands of photographs of these bears. So don't stress. The cool thing is Google different black bear or brown bear and just look more and more and more. Like I said, you just begin to see the face of a black bear and you see the face of a grizzly. This one could have been a little confusing because you don't see a really prominent hump in this particular pose. The face could be misleading, but it does have a wider snout. But look down at the very bottom. Can you see the claws? Yeah, those are the claws of a grizzly, and those short, round kind of. If you grab that ear, you're going to be grabbing like a big puff of fur. And so this is a grizzly. So again, don't stress if you guess wrong. What about this one? Yeah, this is pretty easy. Old black bear. Now you do see it almost looks like it has a hump, but it's got the face of the black bear. It's got those tall, prominent ears, but the face from this widest point kind of tapers down to the snout. That is more indicative of that black bear. What about this one? Can't really see too much of the face. Can see some of the fur. What would you call this? Yeah, this is definitely a black. There's no shoulder hump whatsoever. In fact, it looks like it dents inward. But this is just a young grizzly fur-colored black bear. What about this guy? Good point, Steph. You guys, as hard as this is, you guys are getting really good looks at these bears. If you are hiking, if you're in the backcountry, oftentimes you see parts of a bear, and so hopefully you're not that close that you're just seeing a small part, but a lot of times you don't get really good looks, and a lot of times these bears are on the move, and they're not going to stop and pose for you. But this right here, this is a good one. This is a female grizzly, but it's got that kind of stockier face to it. You can see some claws on its left paws, the longer claw. There you can't see the hump too well, but this is a female grizzly. What about this one? Angie, the only reason I knew it was a female is I know the photographer, and he was the one that told me it was a female because they follow it to get pictures of the cubs. So it's you can differentiate between a male and female if you see the underside if she's lactating, but you can. It's not very easy to differentiate between the two with a lone bear. If you see enough, you can start to get guesses, but it's not 100%. Well, folks, believe it or not, this is a young grizzly. And again, I'm not doing this to really trip you up, but this is a classic example of a small grizzly can easily be mistaken for a black bear. But this is a young grizzly. You can't see the claws. There's really no good way to differentiate other than the fact that we knew Mama Grizzly was off to the right. And so it's definitely an art to it as much as it is a science. All right. Actually, I put these two together because this is a young grizzly. And here's, well, it's not an old black bear, but you can see the similarity between these two. But this one here is a black bear, although it's got kind of grizzly kind of looking fur to it. Again, a narrower face with the black bear. What do you think these are? And they're not polar bears. Angie asked if their teeth are different. They have the same number of teeth. Obviously, a larger grizzly or brown bear is going to have larger, sharper teeth. And a black bear will tend to have a little bit smaller, narrower teeth. But they're same kind of dentition, just different facial structure holding those teeth. Yes, these are black bears. Kermode, these are actually mom and cub, but they're both black bears. The one on the left is an adult spirit bear, Kermode bear, just a different variety, different subspecies of black bear. This is easy simply because you see his claws very easily. Yeah, this is a big old grizz. I don't know why I put this one because this is what most people think all grizzlies look like. Big, blocky, stocky, wide head. And that's what a lot of grizzlies do look like, but you saw from all those previous pictures, not all of them. All right, I'm going to end it with my favorite. This is one that threw Facebook for a loop. I believe most of you have seen this, but this is one that was like, it was amazing the number of people that swore it was one species and another group of people swore it was another species. The cool thing, and what I loved about this picture, and I contacted the gentleman who took this picture, I guessed right away that it was a black bear. And everyone else, not everyone, a lot of people were saying it was a grizzly. The coolest thing was I took this picture, and this, I hate when people will say trust me because you never know if you can trust someone. But I took this photograph and I put it into a Facebook forum that consists of all bear biologists, literally from all over the world. Most of them are from North America, but it's a big group of bear biologists. And I put this photo up there. Every single one of them immediately came back with a black bear. And well, people say, well, how do you know it's a black bear? This is the exact same bear from the side. And right away you start seeing that straight profile. Does have the hump that you see in here, but that straight profile, this is classic black bear. And so some of these poses can be very, very confusing. And so I'm going to end it with one last photo. You tell me what you think this bear is. Believe it or not, this is, and I laugh because this is the same bear as this. And so depending on which way that bear turns, again, it's an art form. And if you look at one picture can absolutely fool you. And I've been fooled before. Stephanie's been fooled. Gotcha, Steph. It becomes one of those things where you just have to look at lots and lots of pictures, and then you begin to really differentiate. Now, again, I will tell you, the vast majority of bears will be really easy to tell. The classic grizzly look, classic black bear look. What I'm trying to teach you is those tough bears, and there's some of those bears out there. you guys are going to be leaps and bounds above 99% of the public out there. They're not usually this difficult, but this is the black bear. It's the same bear, just different pose. But you can see how it can be very tricky with a single photograph. All right, I'm going to end it here. This is the bonus question. All right, which track is which? One is a black, one is a brown. Which the picture on the left, is that a black bear or is that the brown bear or grizzly? Yeah, you guys got it down. Like I said, you're 99% above everybody else that's venturing to the west. The black bear, when you draw that line to capture all of his toes, that line is going to go through its main pad. You can't capture all the toes above that line. The grizzly, on the other hand, has those toes that almost form a line, and when you draw that line between the toes and the pad, it's almost separate. And so black bear on the left, grizzly track on the right. Very, very important. If you're hiking Yellowstone, Alaska, wherever, and you see very fresh tracks, you might not see the animal itself, but knowing what kind of animal is there is really going to help dictate what you do next. So anyway, know your bears. It's not something that you learn right away. I've been studying bears for 25 years. Stephanie's been doing it for 10 years. But just relax and enjoy. These animals are wonderful. If you know what kind of animal you're looking at, you know how to react around them, you're going to have a lifetime of enjoyment around these, around these critters. So, got to give photo credit. Ashley Haskett gave me a bunch. That Craig Goodwin is the one that gave me a bunch of those really difficult ones. They're fantastic. So, y'all know how to follow us on our website. Stephanie did the website for us. Big thing is follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Please leave comments, good, bad, critique, reviews. We can only get better if you tell us how we're doing. I will tell you, mark your calendars. I'm taking a 3-week vacation because I've got a lot going on this month. But the next class I'm teaching is going to be the wonderful wapiti. If you've never heard of that term before, it is the Native American term for elk. And we're going to be talking all about elk and their triumphant comeback because their numbers were extremely dwindled decades ago, but they're coming back in force all over North America. But that will be 3 weeks from today, Thursday, October 1st. I hope you can join us. I'll send information for that on Facebook. But you guys are awesome. And if you have any more questions, I know Steph has saved me by answering a ton of them. Okay. Steph told me to answer this. I've talked before that bears are crepuscular, and Stephanie defined it. Crepuscular is they're active around sunrise or sunset. But what about an overcast day? Will they become active then? Also, will bears change their behaviors and become nocturnal if too many human encounters in their habitat? Yes to all of that. Well, primarily yes to the fact that humans will drive animal behavior. When you look at what dictates why an animal moves, there's some primary causes. First off, the primary cause is why animals get up and move around. It's because they're hungry. They're going in search of food. Another thing is they need to thermoregulate. They're either too cold or too hot. So they either have to get a drink or find shade, or if they're too cold, they want to find some thermal cover. They might go into thicker vegetation. The other another thing that drives animals obviously is mating season. When it's that time of the year, they're going to be driven by hormones to move and find a mate. But the other big thing is predation. Especially like if you're talking about deer, deer will move if there is a coyote, if there's a human, if there's a wolf, if there's a cougar, they're going to move away from a predator. Now, in the case of bears, they don't have any natural predators in the animal kingdom, so to speak, but humans are a big foe to these bears. And so human behavior or human presence often dictates bears moving or changing their behavior. And so if there's a lot of people in an area, bears are going to vacate it. They don't want to deal with those people. And so they will typically avoid humans as much as they can. So that can definitely drive when they're active, especially if humans are active in an area. Now, you did mention about overcast days. Um, Remember, it's not so much. A lot of people think the moonlight will drive animals to move, and they're moving because they're hungry, because they're cold, hot or cold, they're looking for love, or there's something chasing them. And so just because the weather is one way or another, um, or the sunlight with the overcast day, it doesn't typically drive them. But having said that, you're likely to see a bear at any point in the day. Sorry for the long-winded response. Just wanted to be thorough. Okay, Evelyn says, when does a hump grow on a grizzly, and does lack of food affect the hump? And Stephanie did mention it. It's actually a massive muscle. It's crazy how strong these animals are. And I actually read something not too long ago that tried to compute how much stronger they are than humans based on the muscle attachments, how many fast firing and slow firing muscles. And I don't recall the precision of it, but they are crazy strong. And that hump is just part of their muscle mass. Remember, those grizzlies, they are oftentimes, look at that photo. Look at those claws. That thing can flip over rocks in search of grubs and moths and insects that it would take two men to lift a rock, and these grizzlies can flip it with one paw. And so that hump starts growing. When these bears grow, they're going to develop and mature really quickly. And the more food they get into, those bigger those muscles are, hence the bigger the hump is. Well, I'm glad I was able to teach you about delayed implantation. Okay, Virginia says, can you quickly explain the homing instinct of the black bear and perhaps the grizzly? I can talk about it. I don't know if I can explain it because it boggles our mind how these bears are able to return to a place, even when they've sometimes been relocated. And we've had instances of black bears that have been trapped and relocated, and they have this tremendous homing instinct to return home. How they do it, no one really knows. We just know that they do it, and they're really good. I will say it's probably not based on smell. They have a tremendous sense of smell, can sometimes smell animal carcass. It's been documented where grizzlies have smelled either a moose carcass or a whale carcass from up to 20 miles away, but that all depends on humidity, wind direction. They can't smell something if those particles aren't in the air. When it comes to the homing instinct, it's probably not smell related simply because the distance just does not allow that bear to smell its home range from that far away. Again, how they do it, it's crazy. We don't know. The one thing that is so interesting to me now, obviously many of you know I'm the de facto bear biologist on that Bruno webpage because this bear from Wisconsin just suddenly decided to go on this southern journey. And there's a lot of questions about why he's doing it. Unfortunately, we don't really know why, other than he's doing it. And it looks like he's on the move again and heading even further south into southern Arkansas, or at least mid Arkansas right now. So from Wisconsin to where he is in Arkansas right now, that is over 700 miles, 750 miles. And so we don't know why he's doing it. One thought is that he was a southern bear that accidentally got misplaced. Maybe he got on a barge heading north on the Mississippi and is just trying to come home. That's a lovely thought, but we won't know that until we pull DNA from that bear. All right. Are there any other questions for me, Steph? Let me know if there's something I need to answer. I cannot thank you enough for monitoring that chat box stuff. You are definitely a lifesaver because trying to trying to do my slide presentation and read the chat box is as hard as walking and chewing gum for me. Well, good deal. I tell you what, I will thank you for joining us tonight. I hope you learned. Don't get discouraged if you got a number of those photographs wrong. I did pick very hard ones, but I just want to stress the point that it's not a slam dunk all the time. Most cases are, but there may be a bear that can confuse you, and it's in your best interest, especially if you're in the backcountry. It's in your best interest to figure what kind of bear you're dealing with because your reaction might be tremendously different. So enjoy talking to you guys tonight. You guys are fantastic. I will send the recording out, um, hopefully in a few short minutes. Huge thank you to Stephanie for monitoring the chat box. Trish, I don't know if there was any technical difficulties, but you guys are awesome as usual. And hopefully I'll see you on the next webinar, October 1st. It will be all about elk. Otherwise, adios. Have a great night, and I look forward to seeing you guys again.